I'm typically not the paranoid kind. But when Clara came into our lives, things changed. I tried to brush it off at first, chalking up my discomfort to the usual unease that comes with someone new in the house. After all, when my dad started dating again, I knew things would be different. It had been just the two of us for years since my mom passed, so adjusting to someone else in the picture was bound to be weird. But Clara was more than just weird. It started with the kind of things you try to convince yourself aren't worth worrying about. The first time I noticed something was off, I didn't think much of it. I was sitting in my room late at night studying for a history test. I had the window cracked open to let in the cool night air, and the house was quiet. Too quiet. I remember the exact moment. I had my headphones on, drowning out the silence with music when I caught movement out of the corner of my eye. A shadow flickered across the hall near my door. I pulled off my headphones, listening intently, but all I could hear was the faint rustle of leaves outside. It wasn't unusual for my dad to wander the house at night. He had trouble sleeping, especially after my mom's death, and I figured it was him passing by. But something didn't sit right. That shadow, it seemed too small to be my dad. I pushed the thought aside and went back to studying, but a nagging feeling lingered at the back of my mind. A week later, I caught Clara in the kitchen at an odd hour. It was around 2 a.m., and I had just come back from a friend's house after studying for exams. I wasn't trying to be sneaky or anything, but when I opened the front door as quietly as possible, I didn't expect to see her standing there in the dark. She didn't notice me at first. She was just standing by the window, looking out into the backyard. I froze for a moment, wondering if she was sleepwalking. Her back was to me, motionless in the dim light from the window. "Clara?" I whispered, hesitant. She didn't turn around immediately. In fact, she didn't move at all. I felt a chill creep up my spine. Something about her stillness seemed off, too rigid, too unnatural. I tried again, my voice a little louder this time. "Clara, are you okay?" Finally, she turned, but it was slow, almost mechanical, like she hadn't heard me at all. Her face was blank, her eyes unfocused, as if she had just woken up from a deep sleep. "I thought I heard something," she said softly, her voice distant. "Just making sure the windows were closed." That didn't make sense. The windows were already shut. I'd seen them before I left. But I didn't push it. I just nodded and went upstairs, trying to shake the strange encounter from my mind. It wasn't until I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, that I realized how tense I had been the whole time. Like my body knew something was wrong even before my mind could catch up. Over the next few days, Clara's strange behavior became harder to ignore. She was always around, always hovering in the background. At first, I tried to tell myself that I was just being paranoid, but it wasn't just me who noticed. Even my dad started to mention how she seemed a little off sometimes. She'd disappear into rooms for long periods or stand by the windows at odd hours, staring out at nothing. One night, as we were having dinner, she suddenly stood up, mid-bite, and walked into the hallway without a word. My dad and I exchanged a look, but he just shrugged, trying to make light of it. "She's probably just tired," he said, but his voice didn't sound convincing. I wanted to believe him. I really did, but it was hard to ignore the growing pit in my stomach. A few days later, I had another encounter with Clara, one I couldn't shake off. It was a Saturday, and I'd spent most of the day in my room, avoiding everyone. I didn't feel like talking to my dad, and being around Clara made my skin crawl. Around midnight, I heard soft footsteps outside my room. They stopped right by my door, and then nothing. Just silence. I sat up in bed, staring at the door. Maybe it was my dad checking on me, but something told me it wasn't him. I held my breath, listening for any movement, but the house was dead quiet. After what seemed like forever, the footsteps continued. This time, they moved down the hall toward the staircase. Slowly, I crept out of bed and peeked into the hallway. There she was, Clara, standing at the top of the stairs facing the wall. Her back was to me, but she was completely still again, like she was waiting for something or someone. I felt a wave of nausea rise in my throat. What the hell was she doing? I wanted to say something, to call out to her, but fear clamped my throat shut. Instead, I retreated back into my room, closing the door softly and locking it behind me. My hands were shaking as I leaned against the door, trying to make sense of what I had just seen. Was she sleepwalking? Was she losing it? That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined Clara standing at the top of the stairs, waiting. The next morning, I tried to talk to my dad about it. I told him about the footsteps, about Clara standing there in the dark, not moving. He just sighed, rubbing his temples like he was too tired to deal with any of it. "Look, she's been through a lot," he said. "Maybe she's just adjusting. Give her some time." But I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more, something my dad didn't want to admit. Clara wasn't just acting strange. There was something deeply wrong with her, and I was the only one who could see it. A week later, things took a turn for the worse. It was the middle of the night again, and I woke up to the feeling that someone was watching me. My room was dark, the only light coming from the street lamp outside my window. I squinted into the shadows, and that's when I saw her. Clara was standing in the doorway. I stood still, my heart beating frantically. She was just standing there, watching me. "What are you doing?" I managed to choke out. She didn't respond. She didn't move. I could see the faint glint of her eyes in the darkness, fixed on me. "Clara, what are you doing?" I said again, louder this time. Slowly, she stepped into the room, her bare feet making no sound on the carpet. She walked over to the window, her movements slow and deliberate, and then she reached out and shut it. "You left the window open," she said, her voice monotone. I didn't leave the window open. I hadn't touched it since the morning. Panic rose in my chest as she turned back toward me, her face blank, her eyes cold. I wanted to scream, to tell her to get out, but the words caught in my throat. Instead, I just sat there, staring at her, my whole body trembling. For what felt like an eternity, we stayed like that, me frozen in my bed, and her standing by the window, watching me with that same unsettling gaze. Finally, she turned and left the room, closing the door behind her without a word. I didn't sleep that night. I just lay there, staring at the door, waiting for her to come back. The next morning, I confronted my dad again. I told him everything. About Clara standing in my room, about her closing the window, about the footsteps outside my door at night. But he didn't believe me. He said I was overreacting, that I was reading too much into things. "She's not a threat," he insisted. "She's just different. Give her a break." I wanted to believe him, but deep down I knew something was wrong. Something was seriously wrong with Clara. A few days later, she was gone. No warning, no explanation. My dad just came home one night and said she had left, said she needed space, time to figure things out. He didn't seem surprised, just resigned. But I couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't really gone. Not completely. Sometimes I wake up with the feeling that someone is watching me from the shadows, and sometimes when I look out my bedroom window, I swear I see her standing in the yard, watching the house. I haven't told my dad. He wouldn't believe me anyway, but I know Clara's still out there. I never thought of myself as someone easily rattled. I've lived alone for years, traveled to all sorts of places, and had my fair share of late nights walking through unfamiliar streets. My condo in Fort Lauderdale was supposed to be a peaceful escape, one of those places where I could unwind, especially after stressful work trips. The building itself was relatively modern, clean, and quiet, which is why I picked it. Most of my neighbors were retirees or snowbirds who only lived there part-time, which meant the place was usually half empty, especially during the off-season. I loved it. I never imagined that the same peace and quiet I cherished could turn into something so unsettling. It all started on a Monday night. I'd just come back from a weekend trip upstate, exhausted but grateful to be home. I dropped my bags in the entryway, tossed my keys on the counter, and settled into the couch, planning to spend the evening mindlessly flipping through TV channels. Everything felt normal at first. The condo was its usual self, still, quiet, the occasional hum of the air conditioning the only sound breaking the silence. I could hear the faint murmur of waves outside from the beach nearby, which was why I had bought this place in the first place. The distant crash of water was always calming. After watching a few episodes of some forgettable show, I decided to take a break and make myself a quick dinner. As I stood in the kitchen, waiting for water to boil, I noticed something strange, a faint tapping sound, barely audible over the TV in the background. At first, I didn't think much of it. Living in a condo means getting used to random noises. Pipes, wind, maybe a neighbor in the hallway. It could be anything. I went back to stirring the pot, assuming the sound would stop, but it didn't. The tapping continued, soft at first, then louder. It wasn't rhythmic, more like someone was knocking lightly on something or pacing outside my door. I looked toward the hallway. The front door was shut, the deadbolt locked. No reason to worry, but the tapping grew louder. I moved toward the door, listening more closely, trying to pinpoint where the sound was coming from. It sounded like it was just on the other side, as if someone was standing there, tapping against the wood with their fingers. I stopped a few feet from the door and stared at it. Was someone out there? A neighbor, maybe? But it was late, close to midnight, and I hadn't heard anyone in the hall all day. I stood there, frozen, unsure whether to open the door or walk away. The tapping stopped. I waited. My mind was racing with all the worst-case scenarios, but after another minute of silence, I laughed at myself and turned to go back to the kitchen. That's when I heard it. Someone knocked. This time, it wasn't just a faint tap. It was a knock, loud, firm, 3 sharp raps against the door. I whipped around, staring at the door, waiting for some explanation to present itself. A neighbor? A package delivery? This late at night? It didn't make any sense. I walked slowly to the door, the sound of my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. I looked through the peephole, expecting to see someone standing there, but when I looked, there was nothing. No one. The hallway outside was empty. I backed away from the door, my mind reeling. Maybe they'd knocked and left? I tried to rationalize it, but it didn't sit right with me. Something about it felt off. I sat back down on the couch, trying to convince myself that I was overreacting. It was just a knock, probably nothing. But the tension in my chest didn't ease. I found myself constantly looking at the door, expecting to hear another knock or see the doorknob turn. Half an hour passed, then an hour. The tension started to fade, and I finally convinced myself that it had been some random, harmless occurrence. I went to bed around 2 a.m., still a little on edge, but too tired to care anymore. The next day was uneventful, almost to the point where I started to feel stupid for being so worked up. I went about my day as usual, worked from home, went for a run on the beach, came back, showered, and relaxed on the couch again. By evening, the memory of the strange knocking was already fading. I chalked it up to some harmless prank or someone confused about which condo they were visiting. Around midnight, I was getting ready for bed when I heard it again. The knock. Louder this time, more insistent. I froze in place, my toothbrush still in my mouth, staring at the bathroom door. The knock came again and again. Whoever it was wasn't going away this time. I spat out the toothpaste and quickly walked to the front door. My hands were shaking as I reached for the doorknob. I hesitated, remembering the empty hallway from the night before, but the knocking didn't stop. I looked through the peephole again, expecting to see no one there. But this time, there was. A man stood outside, hunched over, his face too close to the door. His features were hard to make out through the fisheye lens of the peephole, but he had an unmistakable look of anger or frustration, like he'd been waiting for hours. He raised his fist and knocked again, harder this time. I backed away from the door, my pulse racing. Who was this guy? And what did he want? For a moment, I considered opening the door to ask him, but something held me back. A deep, primal instinct that screamed at me not to do it. Instead, I stayed silent, hoping he would just go away, but he didn't. He kept knocking, louder, angrier. He banged on the door, rattling the frame. His voice came next, low and gravely, but I couldn't make out the words. I pressed my back against the wall, trying to stay calm. Should I call the cops? What if it was just a misunderstanding? But something about the way he kept knocking, the way his voice dripped with malice, made me hesitate. The banging grew louder. He was pounding on the door now, harder and harder, like he was trying to break it down. I could hear the wood creaking under the force of his fists. Then suddenly it stopped. I waited, holding my breath, listening for any sign that he was still out there. But all I heard was silence. I looked through the peephole again. He was gone. I let out a shaky breath, relief washing over me. Maybe he'd finally given up. But just as I started to relax, I heard something that chilled me to the bone, a scraping sound. It was coming from the door, soft at first, then louder. I pressed my ear against the wood, listening. It sounded like metal dragging against the doorframe. My heart leaped into my throat. What was he doing? I looked through the peephole again, but all I could see was his head, too close to the door. The scraping continued. My hands trembled as I backed away from the door. Was he trying to pick the lock? Break in? My chest tightened with fear. I don't know how long I stood there, listening to that sound, frozen in place. Eventually, it stopped. I don't know what made him leave, but when I finally had the courage to look through the peephole again, the hallway was empty. I barely slept that night. Every shadow outside my window had me on edge, convinced that he was coming back. I locked all the doors, double-checked the windows, but nothing could shake the feeling that I wasn't safe anymore. The next morning, I reported the incident to the building manager, but they didn't take me seriously. It was probably a drunk or a homeless guy, they said, brushing me off. These things happen sometimes. But I knew better. That man wasn't just some random drunk. He knew what he was doing, and I had the sinking feeling that he wasn't done with me yet. For the next week, I lived in a constant state of anxiety. Every night, I waited for the knocking to return, but it never did. I started to think that maybe it was over, that maybe the guy had finally moved on. But that feeling of being watched, of being hunted, never left me. Then, one evening, as I was coming home from work, I saw something that stopped me in my tracks. There, sitting in the lobby of the building, was the man from the hallway. He was sitting on one of the benches, staring blankly ahead, as if waiting for something. For me. Our eyes met, and for a split second, I thought about confronting him. But then, that same primal instinct kicked in, telling me to walk away. I didn't. I couldn't. I hurried past him, heart racing, and locked myself inside my condo. That was the last time I saw him. I don't know who he was. I don't know why he targeted me, but I'll never forget the sound of his knocking, the way it reverberated through the door, the way it echoed in my mind long after he was gone. Some nights when the condo is quiet and the world outside is still, I swear I can still hear it. The knock. I always preferred driving at night. There's something calming about the empty highways, the way the world feels asleep, and the quiet that surrounds you. It's just you, the road, and your thoughts. But that night, I wished I hadn't stayed out so late. I had been visiting my sister in a small town a couple of hours from where I live. It wasn't an unusual trip. I'd been making it for years, every few months, to catch up and spend some time with her family. But I'd lost track of time, and before I knew it, it was pushing 1 a.m. when I finally left. The highway was long and empty, just the way I liked it. My headlights stretched out ahead, illuminating the road and the occasional sign. I was cruising along, enjoying the solitude, when I noticed my gas gauge creeping close to empty. I had forgotten to fill up before I left my sister's place. I wasn't exactly in a populated area. The road stretched through vast expanses of fields and woods. Here and there, a lone farmhouse appeared amidst the endless expanse. I hadn't seen a gas station in miles. I flipped on my GPS, hoping to find something nearby, but the nearest station was over 20 minutes away. I looked at the gauge again. There was no way I was making it that far. I'd have to pull over soon, or risk running out of gas in the middle of nowhere. I drove for another few miles, growing more anxious with each passing minute, when I finally saw a sign. A faded, rusted one, but a sign nonetheless. Gas. The arrow pointed down a narrow side road that branched off from the highway. I hesitated for a second, unsure whether to trust it. It looked like the kind of place that might not even be open this late, but I didn't have much of a choice. I made the turn and followed the road for about 5 minutes before the station came into view. It was one of those old, rundown places you only see in movies. A single pump stood beneath a flickering overhead light, and the small convenience store behind it looked dark, except for the glow of a lone fluorescent bulb inside. It wasn't exactly welcoming, but at least it was something. I pulled up to the pump and turned off the engine. The night was still, eerily quiet. I stepped out of the car, stretching my legs, and looked around. No one was there. Not a single car. The place looked abandoned, but the pump seemed to be operational, so I swiped my card and started filling up. As the gas flowed into the tank, I found myself glancing toward the convenience store. The inside was dimly lit, but through the dirty windows, I could make out a man standing behind the counter. He was staring straight ahead, unmoving. I hadn't noticed him when I first pulled up, but now that I did, something about him seemed off. He didn't move, didn't wave or nod. He just stood there, staring blankly ahead. I tried to ignore the weird feeling creeping up my spine, telling myself it was just late and I was tired. Maybe the guy was zoning out or half asleep. I mean, it must be boring working the night shift at a place like this. Still, I kept stealing glances at him as I waited for the pump to finish. But every time I looked, he was in the exact same position, like he hadn't moved an inch. Finally, the pump clicked, and I put the nozzle back, relieved that I could get out of there. I reached for my wallet to grab some cash and decided to head inside to pay for the gas. It felt wrong just leaving without acknowledging the guy, even if he was a little strange. As I walked toward the convenience store, the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. Something about the whole place felt wrong, like I didn't belong there. The closer I got to the door, the heavier the air seemed to feel. I pushed the door open, and the little bell above it jingled, breaking the silence. The man behind the counter still didn't move. His eyes remained fixed straight ahead, not even acknowledging that I had entered. Just here to pay for gas," I said, my voice sounding too loud in the empty store. No response. I took a few steps closer to the counter, trying to get a better look at him. He was older, maybe in his late 50s, with thinning hair and deep wrinkles etched into his face. His skin had an odd grayish tint to it, like he hadn't seen sunlight in a long time. "Hello?" I called out, waving my hand a little to get his attention. Nothing. I felt a shiver run down my spine. Something was very, very wrong. I took a step back, suddenly wanting to get out of there as quickly as possible. But just as I turned to leave, I heard it. A voice. "Long night for driving, isn't it?" I froze. The voice was low, gravelly, and definitely not friendly. Slowly, I turned back around. The man was staring at me now, his eyes cold and unsettling. He hadn't moved from his spot behind the counter, but there was something in the way he looked at me that made my blood run cold. "Yeah, I guess," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "Just heading home." He smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was the kind of smile you see on someone who knows something you don't, something you'd rather not know. "Not many people come through here at this hour," he said, his voice dripping with something I couldn't quite place. "Especially not alone." The way he said alone sent a jolt of fear through me. I suddenly felt exposed, vulnerable. The station was completely isolated, and there was no one around for miles. "Yeah, well, I'm just passing through," I said, fumbling for my wallet and tossing a few bills on the counter. "Here's for the gas." He didn't move to take the money. Instead, he just kept staring at me, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Where you headed?" he asked, his voice low and slow. "Home," I repeated, stepping back toward the door. "It's late. I should go." He smiled again, but this time it was wider, more unsettling. "You might want to be careful on these roads," he said. "Lots of accidents out here. People get lost." I didn't wait to hear any more. I turned on my heel and practically ran out of the store, the bell jingling faintly behind me as I slammed the door shut. I hurried back to my car. I jumped in and locked the doors, looking back toward the convenience store. The man was still standing there, watching me through the dirty windows. His smile hadn't faded. I jammed the key into the ignition and started the car, pulling out of the gas station as fast as I could. My heart didn't stop racing until I was back on the highway, the station disappearing into the distance behind me. For the next 20 minutes, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. I kept checking my mirrors, expecting to see headlights behind me, but the road remained empty. The second I began to feel calm again, I noticed something strange in the rearview mirror. At first, it was just a flicker of movement, a shadow. I thought it was my imagination, a trick of the darkness and the tiredness settling in. But then I saw it again. A figure, sitting in the back seat. My heart skipped a beat. I whipped my head around, expecting to see someone there, but the back seat was empty. I was alone. I turned back to the road, my hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. It had to be my mind playing tricks on me. I was tired. I was on edge after the weird encounter at the gas station. But the feeling of someone watching me didn't go away. For the rest of the drive, I couldn't shake the sensation. It was as if there was someone, or something in the car with me, just out of sight. I kept checking the rearview mirror, but every time I looked, the back seat was empty. When I finally pulled into my driveway, I let out a breath I didn't realize I had been holding. I sat there for a moment, staring at my quiet house, trying to calm my nerves. The weirdness of the night weighed heavily on me, but at least I was home. I was safe. I turned off the engine, grabbed my bag, and stepped out of the car. That's when I saw it. The man, standing at the end of my driveway, just beyond the reach of the streetlights. His face was hidden in the shadows, but I knew it was him, the man from the gas station. My breath caught in my throat, my pulse pounding in my ears. I blinked, my mind scrambling to make sense of what I was seeing, but when I looked again, he was gone. The driveway was empty. I stood there for a long time, staring into the darkness, waiting for him to reappear, but he didn't. I don't know how long I stood there, but eventually I went inside, locking every door and window behind me. I didn't sleep that night, and for weeks afterward, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Even now, months later, the events of that night are still fresh in my memory. I've always been the kind of guy who enjoys a quiet night in. After a long week at work, there's nothing better than kicking back in my small apartment, ordering takeout, and watching something to unwind. That night was no different, though I made a decision I would come to regret. I picked a horror movie. It wasn't even one of those cheesy, predictable ones. No, this movie was the kind that gets under your skin. You know, the kind that doesn't rely on cheap jump scares, but slowly digs its way into your brain, making you question every little sound or shadow in your room. By the time the credits rolled, I was feeling that deep-rooted paranoia, that creeping sensation that you're not as alone as you think. I was about to shake it off, chalk it up to the late hour and the unnerving atmosphere of the movie, when I heard it. A faint creak. The kind of sound you'd hear if someone shifted their weight on an old floorboard. At first, I didn't move. I just sat there on the couch, remote still in my hand, eyes flicking to the dark hallway leading to the kitchen. The sound didn't come again. I let out a slow breath, trying to convince myself it was nothing more than my overactive imagination. But you know how it is after a scary movie. Every tiny noise feels like a sign of something more sinister. I told myself it was probably the building settling. It was an old apartment, nothing unusual about a few creaks here and there. I stood up, stretching, my muscles still tense from sitting on the edge of my seat for nearly 2 hours. The clock read 12:47 a.m. Not too late, but late enough that the entire building seemed to be asleep. No sound of TVs through the thin walls, no footsteps from the hallway, just the hum of my fridge in the distance. I walked over to the kitchen to grab a glass of water, flipping the switch as I entered. The fluorescent light buzzed overhead. I took a drink, feeling the cold water soothe the lingering tension in my throat. Everything was normal, but still that unease clung to me like a second skin. And then, I heard it again, that creak, only this time it was louder. I stopped mid-sip, ears straining to catch the direction it was coming from. It wasn't the hallway. It was closer, much closer. Slowly, I lowered the glass and took a step toward the living room, peeking around the corner. Nothing. Just the faint light from the TV, its screen now black, casting a dull glow across the room. My heart picked up pace again, an involuntary reaction, though I tried to force myself to stay calm. I checked the front door, reassured by the sight of the deadbolt securely in place. The window was shut, the curtains drawn. I was alone. At least that's what I kept telling myself. I turned back to the kitchen, intending to finish my water and get ready for bed, when my phone buzzed on the counter. I jumped, stupid I know, but I couldn't help it. I grabbed it, more to reassure myself that everything was fine than anything else. It was just a notification from one of those apps, nothing important. That's when I heard the third creak. This one was unmistakable, coming from the hallway again, but louder, heavier. It was like someone was there, taking careful steps. Every inch of my skin crawled with the kind of dread that you can't explain or rationalize. I moved toward the hallway slowly and peeked around the corner. It was too dark to see anything clearly, but someone was there. A figure, barely visible in the dim light, standing at the far end of the hall near my bedroom door. I froze. My mouth went dry, heart hammering in my chest. For a second, I thought maybe I was still caught in the lingering effects of the movie, that I was imagining things. But then the figure shifted. It moved. I wasn't sure what to do. My instinct was to reach for my phone, but my hands were shaking too badly. My breath came out shallow, my mind racing with 1,000 scenarios, none of them good. I didn't want to shout or make any noise. I didn't know how this person got into my apartment, but the last thing I wanted was to provoke them. I took a step back, praying the floor wouldn't creak under my weight. The figure didn't react. It just stood there, staring into the darkness of my bedroom. I wasn't close enough to make out any details, just a silhouette, but it was definitely a woman. Her long hair fell down her back, and she was dressed in what looked like a jacket and jeans. "Who are you?" I finally managed to croak out. No response, no movement, just silence. I took another step back, feeling the sweat trickle down my spine. This wasn't real. It couldn't be. My mind was playing tricks on me. It had to be. But then she spoke, her voice low as if she was repeating something she'd said 1,000 times. "I need to get my things." Her words didn't make sense. My things? What things? I stood there, my back pressed against the wall now, struggling to process what was happening. Was she lost? Was she confused? I hadn't seen her before, not in the building or anywhere else. "You're in the wrong apartment," I said, my voice trembling. For a moment, I thought she didn't hear me. She didn't react at all, just stood there, her head tilted slightly. Then, slowly, she turned to face me, and that's when I saw her eyes, wide, unblinking, like she was in some kind of trance. My stomach dropped. There was something deeply wrong about the way she looked at me, something that made my skin crawl. She didn't belong here. I don't know how I knew, but I just did. "I need to get my things," she repeated, taking a step toward me. That's when I panicked. "You need to leave," I stammered, my voice rising in pitch. "This isn't your apartment." She didn't stop. She kept walking, her footsteps heavy, like she was moving with a purpose I couldn't understand. My mind raced. Should I run? Should I call the police? But my phone was still on the counter, and she was between me and the door. In that moment, I didn't know what else to do. I turned and bolted for the bathroom, slamming the door shut behind me. My hands fumbled for the lock, twisting it just as I heard her footsteps stop outside the door. I pressed my ear against the wood, holding my breath, listening. Nothing. No movement. No sound. Just silence. For what felt like hours, I stood there, waiting, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure she could hear it. Eventually, I heard the sound of footsteps again, this time retreating down the hallway. The front door clicked open, then closed. I waited, counting the seconds, unsure if she was really gone. When I finally worked up the courage to step out of the bathroom, the apartment was empty. The front door was still locked, the deadbolt in place. No sign of her anywhere. I don't know how she got in. I don't know why she was there. All I know is that when I went upstairs the next day to check with my neighbor, he told me his ex-girlfriend had been by earlier that night trying to get back some things she left behind months ago. But she was gone now. Or at least, that's what he said. If these stories sent chills down your spine, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more terrifying tales. Share your own scary experiences in the comments. You never know, your story might be featured in the next video. Make sure to turn on notifications so you don't miss out on the next dose of fear. And remember, sometimes the scariest things are closer than you think. Stay safe out there. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next nightmare.